May you all be very welcome. I would like to first introduce myself. My name is Catalina Molina Bustamante. I work for the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ, and I will be joining you this morning, providing the moderation for this session. Thank you so much for your interest and for the program that we will be presenting this morning. I would like to especially greet our speakers today joining us. Marta Perez de Madrid. She is a colleague of ours in the German Cooperation Agency, and she's a collaborator in the Biodiversity and Climate Change Hub. Also, Mr. Mario Cotto, Technical Director of the National System of Conservation Areas of the Ministry of Environment of Costa Rica, Mr. Jairo Sancho. He is the coordinator of the same institution, SINAC. He's the program coordinator. And Mr. Luis Alvarado, he's the coordinator of the climatology unit of the Department of Development of the Ministry of Environment and Energy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to also mention that we are going to have a greeting on behalf of the coordinator of the project, the Acción Clima project. And for that, we will be hearing a recording, a small clip for this session.
Las variaciones climáticas obligan a las especies a ajustar sus patrones de comportamiento, pero hoy no hablaremos de problemas y de soluciones. Soy Søren Kirstein, coordinador del proyecto Acción Clima, y desde la GZ Costa Rica les extiendo una cordial bienvenida al lanzamiento del programa Innovación Abierta junto al Sistema Nacional de Áreas de Conservación y el Instituto Meteorológico Nacional. La GZ tiene el compromiso de impulsar la innovación en la agenda de cambio climático con la implementación de las NDCs. Por ello, invitamos a organizaciones especializadas nacionales e internacionales a desarrollar soluciones de adaptación de la biodiversidad en la región para contribuir a las metas climáticas. Participen, contamos con ustedes.
Having received this greeting, we are now going to start with the technical presentation sessions for this morning so that we can learn more about what this Open Innovation Program is about in biodiversity and climate change, and also other relevant aspects on the proposals that we hope that you are able to present within the framework of this program. Very well, we are going to start with my colleague, Marta Perez de Madrid. She is the coordinator of the Regional Hub in Climate Change and Biodiversity, facilitated by the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ. Marta is a specialist in matters of adaptation to climate change and also nature-based solutions. Marta, the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. Everyone joining us today. It is my duty to give you a general overview of the program that we have prepared and which is called Open Innovation, Climate Change and Biodiversity. And for such, today, this is the launching event. So the first thing we wanted to tell you is that the Open Innovation Program is framed within an initiative that is promoted by GIZ in support with the Ministry of Energy and Environment of Costa Rica, and it's called Hub, Innovation, Climate, and Biodiversity, which are the three matters that we work on, and it generates innovative approaches and an exchange of experiences and also the implementation of the NDCs, both of Costa Rica and of the region. This initiative, what it does is to foster or encourage the work that the country has already been doing in matters of generating solutions for climate action and also in the biodiversity agenda, and also to make most of the experience that has been generated by the different institutions at the national level in order to promote the exchange of experiences and to promote or to tap into the exchanges and learnings between peers of Latin America and the Caribbean, and also to move forward the generation of new solutions in those topics where there's still a lot to be done, there's a lot of innovation to be developed, and there's a lot of collaboration that would be benefited by this work. The Open Innovation Program has therefore the goal of connecting public institutions with technical organizations of a high level to develop innovative solutions to the challenges of the climate and biodiversity agenda. This is a mechanism, like I said, which has been developed within a wider platform that we have been working on with the Ministry of Environment and with SINAC, among other institutions as well, and which allows to seek those solutions that certain institutions do not have within their technical teams, to find those, to seek them with the technical accompaniment or support of specialized organizations. There is an important difference between how an open innovation program works, or how we have thought or designed this open innovation program, to maybe a normal bidding process, where in that case, the institution is clear on what it needs to achieve. It is clear on the output a priori, and a bidding process is open that responds specifically to some very particular conditions. And so this program makes it that even much more wider, and from the standpoint, or from a specific standpoint, and more critical on behalf of the institution, which determines that, okay, I do have challenges that I have not been able to solve. I do not know exactly what the best roadmap or way or most efficient or where the higher impact is in which I need to walk on. And this mechanism allows me to explore different options to advance and move forward on the most convenient ones. So in this specific call, which we have called the Biodiversity and Climate Change call, where we are accompanying and supporting the national system of conservation areas, which allows them to improve their understanding of the operation and the management of climate refuges in Costa Rica. Particularly, SINAC has determined that from the different challenges that it faces in order to implement completely the climate and biodiversity agenda through the different planning instruments that it has, this was a specific challenge, the climate refuges challenge, which had multiple options for solution, and which they want to explore along with partners and allies to see which one will be the most innovative, the most functional, the most feasible, in order to be able to establish climate refuges in the country as determined by the Costa Rican national determined contributions. And with this, one of the specific goals of the country is to support the country to move forward in its climate adaptation plan, and also in Costa Rica's NDC. Also, this program is useful to generate and test new approaches, not only to us as a cooperation agency, but also to SINAC and to the National Meteorological Institute, partners of this program, to test new approaches, new methodologies, and to learn on new protocols, to develop innovative protocols that can respond to that double challenge faced by Costa Rica and the countries of the region around climate and biodiversity. Starting or going from these lessons of this program, or the lessons learned, then Costa Rica will also be able to offer its experience to other countries on how to implement the climate refuges, which at the same time, this program assumes or has a pilot project for developing the climate refuges. So in summary, the program that we have designed, we have the premise that it tries, or it aims to be as simple as possible, and as the name says, as open as possible. Now, some characteristics that I will share on behalf of the design, we have been structuring and thinking to allow the organizations that want to participate that wide scope, or that white sheet of paper, or that white canvas to walk through without having specifically a very well roadmap design. So what we have structured is to work on an initial selection for proposals, where we are going to select up to 3 international teams. They can be national, or even at the level of the region, or even other places of the world. Those 3 teams are going to work jointly with SINAC and IMN and with us, and they are going to participate with this solution proposal. They will participate in an innovation immersive workshop that will take place at the end of January and beginning of February. This innovation immersive workshop, what it will allow is to improve and to feedback the solution proposals through a collaborative approach in two ways. Not only of the teams of the organizations with the public institutions, but also among these teams, we hope that there can be a technical feedback. It's not a competition or not a competitive program. It's actually collaborative, where we are trying or seeking to generate as much innovation as possible between an expert group. So it is during this immersive workshop that also a technical tour has been planned to one or two potential climate refuges of Costa Rica, which now our colleague from SINAC, Jairo Sancho, will tell us more about. And he will explain some potentials of these climate refuges and the progress that has been made in the country. And that's going to happen during a week of work, both the workshop as well as the tour or the field tour. And then there will be a couple of additional months where there is support or accompaniment of support with a technical team that we have hired to improve those proposals and those proposal documents from the standpoint of innovation. At the end of the process, along with the institutions, what we will have is an assessment or evaluation of the solutions where we are not imagining a winner, an absolute winner, but an evaluation of the viability of the solutions or the potential solutions for an implementation. Next. Some milestones of the program, we have identified them in this slide. Today, we are doing the launch of the program. We are also going to open a space of consultations or questions because the Open Innovation Program is actually an innovation for institutions themselves. And so we are sure that there's going to be a lot of details that need to be clarified. It's going to be almost 3 weeks of consultations from the 6th of October until the 20th, and this will be done through an email address that we will share next, and then we are going to receive the proposals until November 6th, so there will be a month, and after that we will select the proposals along with SINAC until December 6th, so that's an additional month. And as I said before, the innovation workshop and the technical tour at the end of January and beginning of February. Also, the accompaniment or support in innovation will be during February and March. And what we expect to have is an evaluation of the possible solutions that clearly are not the final or full solution of how it will be implemented, but at least it will be the design of the project between March and April. For this program, we have established 4 criteria, trying to make them as simple as possible, but also that they would provide SINAC a possibility of being able to select the proposals that are most aligned to the work and to the goals that the NDC frames, which is our main framework of action. So the first one is feasibility. How feasible is the implementation of the proposed solution? The second criteria is innovation. What is the level that the proposed solution goes beyond the state of the art and demonstrates the potential for innovation, as well as the use of new technologies, the use of data for decision making, and digital transformation? So it's an important package that contemplates several things, the degree of innovation. And next, we have the functionality and applicability of this solution. How will it work and how will it be applied? And also the impact in the climate agenda and in biodiversity. Moving on to the next one, the profile of organizations. You probably saw this in the agenda and in the invitation, is very wide. And what we are trying to do is to not make this restrictive in any way or in any of the categories that we can establish. So it's addressed both to universities, research centers, non-governmental organizations, companies with a technical profile, or specialized startups. So like I said, this is actually a program of collaboration. And it's not so much, so during this stage, it's not a program where we expect administrative limitations. It's actually to be able to participate, to assess solutions, and to you as organizations to be able to move forward, maybe in the development of technical and scientific knowledge that is being applied in different areas, and how you can foster that or encourage it through this opportunity in part of the action. And lastly, and as a summary, how to participate. Like I said, truly, we want the program to be as open and less restrictive as possible, because we expect, along with SINAC as well, and we have been working the entire year on the design of this program, there's a lot of expectation to be able to receive different guidances and solutions that can help to address this theme and to move forward, because it's truly a very innovative topic. We have not found in other parts, at least in the region, no other country that is implementing the climate refuges. So this is our premise. What we would expect to participate is a document of the solution proposal. We have not determined a specific format or template. It's simply a maximum extension of 5 pages so that the review or assessment can be agile and that it can respond or address these specific questions. First, why is your solution adequate or appropriate for the described challenge? And we will talk further about this, and you can find on the webpage a descriptive fact sheet. How does your solution improve the current state of the problem described? Has this solution been tested before, or why is it an innovative solution? What is needed to prototype and test or use your solution? So this is an important stage of innovation processes. What is foreseen a priori to implement your solution once it has been prototyped? What is the estimated cost for that prototype or to test the solution? And here again, because it's so flexible, it will surely change throughout the workshop, the immersive workshop. So we also hope that it can be arranged, not a specific number. And what is the expected impact of your solution? For example, social, environmental, and financial solutions. So these questions need to be covered completely or fully without being very strict on which one you would like to make more relevant. And next, we are going to have a participant organization form where the organization will be able to include the name of the organization, the team behind the organization, what is the administrative figure or other more administrative details that will be uploaded in the webpage starting Monday. And as a third step, it'll be basically the application, where these two documents, 1 and 2, will need to be shared in digital format to our email in this email address that is shown on screen until the 6th of November. And with this, I finish this general overview of the Open Innovation Program. And I assume there will be a lot of questions, but I think we'll take those in the end. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you very much, Marta, for your presentation and for giving us all these details related to the Open Innovation Program that we are launching this morning. I would like to remind you that the questions will be covered in the end after we hear the 3 presentations that we have for today. And all the information that Marta has explained will be available and in writing on the webpage of the Open Innovation Program. Next, we are going to have the second presentation of the day, and it's in charge of Mr. Mario Cotto Hidalgo. He is the Technical Director of the National System of Conservation Area of the Ministry of Environment and Energy. He is a forestry engineer with a master's degree in environmental management. For over 24 years, he has been working for the National System of Conservation Areas of the Ministry of Environment in the country, supporting processes such as GRUAS, to the Biodiversity Sector Adaptation Strategy to Climate Change and the National Program of Biological Corridors. Please, Don Mario, if the floor is yours. Hello, good morning to each one of you. Thank you very much, Catalina. It is a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you, and especially to share some information about the different processes that we have developed. So as an introduction of the importance that we have identified from SINAC with respect to climate change and biodiversity. So basically, it is important to indicate that Costa Rica has been developing conservation processes using the science and technique for decision making, and this is extremely important because this way we have been achieving goals not only in matters of biodiversity, but also with goals in matters of climate change. So this gives us the opportunity of being able to lead different processes, not only in the region, but also globally, on some background or context to be able to identify basically the places of biodiversity importance in the different ecosystems. We need to remember that Costa Rica made or prepared an analysis of these important places for conserving biodiversity and to fully and comprehensively for the land ecosystems and also the coastal and sea ecosystems. And this work was done in the years between the year or in the years 2006 and 2008. And in that moment, we called this Análisis Gruas Dos. For that occasion, we did not consider the climate variable. And that is important to keep it in mind because it was truly an element that was considered fundamental to face all the situations around climate change that we were starting to see. So basically, the conservation gaps or areas of important relevance for biodiversity conservation are those areas that are so important that need to be conserved, but that still do not have an effective conservation strategy, whether it's public or private. And therefore, we need to work in an interinstitutional, multi-sectoral way in order to achieve or be able to generate the efficient conservation initiatives. Back then, as well, we had developed a friction analysis for the country, and also we had prepared a map of connectivity routes where basically elements such as the land coverage, the river network, the density, and the different highways, and 128 routes of connectivity were identified, which basically means these are places where species could more easily move and transit, and where we eventually could be able, in a more simple way, to establish biological corridors. Back then, we were able to confirm the importance and the good design of some biological corridors that already existed back then. And for then we can remember that Costa Rica and in general, the Mesoamerican region was, for the year 2005, 2006, was completing the entire initiative around the Mesoamerican biological corridor, which had established several biological corridors in the countries of the region in order to interconnect, especially in the protected wildlife areas of the different countries. And with regard to the connectivity routes, in our case, there was also a prioritization made, and this prioritization giving it different ways of relevance, identifying or actually considering those routes that were already included within a biological corridor or that also went through some conservation gap would also be given a greater weight to those connectivity routes in order to try to push forward or promote their consolidation. With regard to the topic of the climate resources. So from the theory, we had already been analyzing the speed of climate change and its impact on ecosystems, understanding that this impact is variable and that in some cases it can even overcome the capacity of adaptation of many species. However, there are also paleoclimatic studies that evidence the existence of climate refuges that allowed some species to survive, even regional changes in climate that overcame their capacity for adaptation. So these refuges come from non-homogeneous patterns of change in climate. And so the speed of climate change can be variable. So the previous remark suggests that some places where the changes in climate are reduced or slower, they could be considered as important climate refuges for species and habitats, which could be marginalized through other ecological changes in other places. So thinking about this entire process of generating information that was happening after we finished that analysis of GRUAS 2 in the year 2008, we started to seriously consider the need of working on the inclusion of the climate variable within the analysis of GRUAS 2, especially for the land ecosystems, and also to do a validation of what our biological corridor system was, the one we had already been working on. So with support from technical cooperation, which we were able to do with the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, a project is developed or generated in order to work on what we were encouraging mostly as the adaptation strategy for the adaptation for the biodiversity and climate change. And there was a study in the year 2014 and 2015 that its goal was to update, redesign, and adjust two conservation measures for adaptation in the biodiversity sector for climate change. So basically GRUAS 2 and the biological corridor system. With regard to the methodology, here the fundamental aspects that we were looking at was to understand, or on one side, to confirm and understand or identify if the representativeness of the biodiversity of their country related to climate change with the work that had done before could be confirmed, or if we needed to do additional efforts in order to safeguard not only our support of the ecosystems, but also to identify places where that biodiversity could have areas where they could generate better processes of adaptation for climate change. So from one side, there was the entire characterization, abiotic characterization of biodiversity, also on the identification of climate refuges, and also looking at the biodiversity of the landscape to have a regional matrix with a view that could be more holistic or more comprehensive. With regard to the definition, so basically climate refuges are defined as those places with a smaller relative change in future climate with respect to relative magnitude of anomalies in future climate, or in a more complex way, those areas where their future climate anomalies are decoupled from the regional trends. For example, mountain shades or different or hydrological or water refuges. With regard to the approach or the focus, back then what was proposed was under the climate refuges strategy that the microclimates or places that are relatively small with different climate conditions as the landscape would have the right role with changes in the patterns of species because they provide refuge to species during periods of climate change. For example, vegetable species during the last maximum glacier, and also which could be important for future climate changes. So there, we also identified 3 ways in which microclimates can play a role in the redistribution of species under future climate scenarios, and identified as one of these forms the microclimates, places where the populations of species can stay until the climate goes back to its original conditions. So these are places where populations can survive in microclimates for limited periods of time, and also trampoline areas where there's successive series of microclimates that are in the middle, and these help with the distribution changes of species. This identification of microclimates is based mainly in identifying very specifically the variations of temperature with regard to the elevation, incident radiation, and this topic is important in different areas of the world. Also, the drainage of cold air, places of shade of rains and winds, and also the effect of water bodies, topography, and the use of soil in convection and precipitation or rainfall. For the case of Costa Rica, because back then there was no information that would allow us to identify these phenomena that were explained in the study that took place between 2014 and 2015, we had these they selected these places with a lower speed of climate change as a proxy. So these could contain microclimates and which could serve as micro-refuges. And of course, also redemption places or trampoline areas with regard to changes to temperature. The identification of those climate refuges was done using the climate speed level according to the future changes in the annual average temperature and also mean average rainfall, determining the areas where the speed of change is relatively less. The speed of the temperature and rainfall based on kilometers per year that need to be traveled by a species to maintain its isothermality, it was estimated as a temporal gradient of year per kilometer, and also the spatial gradient where changes in temperature related to degrees Celsius per kilometer, and the relationship of that of rainfall in millimeters per kilometer. This is the result or outcome received or obtained from all this study process, where the climate refuges are identified for the year 2050 using basically identifying slower zones of climate change speed, where we would have an annual average temperature and an average rainfall that are where these places as climate refuges are considered for Costa Rica. Some facts or data that I would like to share with all of you to understand the dimension of what we are talking about with regard to these climate refuges in the country. Well, the area identified was 241,310.53 hectares, and we identified climate refuges that are already within conservation strategies, and that accounts for 185,240 hectares of that total, which is a 76.76%. These climate refuges, which are within that are already included in a conservation strategy, can be subdivided in those that are in protected wildlife areas with 142,000 hectares, those that are included within biological corridors, which are over 37,000 hectares, and those that are within conservation gaps, which account for more than 5,000 hectares. Understanding that effectively these conservation gaps the big work here would also be to establish effective criteria for conservation in order to achieve maintaining or holding or recovering those representative samples of the ecosystems that are identified there. On the other hand, we also have climate refuges, which are not included of any of the strategies that I just mentioned, and that is over 56,000 hectares, which basically is 23.24% of the total land area of the climate refuges identified in the country. So just as a context, a little bit, this is what I wanted to share with all of you so that we can have the dimension, the story, and be able to understand why, from the standpoint of biodiversity and climate change, working within the framework of climate refuges for Costa Rica becomes extremely important, especially because of our topography conditions, which generate a lot of microclimates, and also the distance or how close we are to big water bodies like the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So I am here to answer any of your questions at the end. And again, thank you all very much for participating in this open innovation program working on climate change and biodiversity, especially or specifically on climate refuges. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mario, and thank you for this wide landscape that you have given us on what the country has done with regard to the topic of climate refuges. Next, we have the presentation of Mr. Luis Fernando Alvarado Gamboa. He is the coordinator of the climatology unit of the Department of Development of the National Meteorological Institute, also part of the Ministry of Energy and Environment. Mr. Luis Fernando has a degree in meteorology of the University of Costa Rica and also is a focal point for research in climate change prediction. So, Luis Fernando, the floor is yours. We cannot hear him. He is muted.
Por favor, puede abrir el micrófono. Gracias.
Excuse me. And if you could please speak not so fast, because we are interpreting simultaneously so that the interpreter might follow the content. Thank you very much, Catalina, and good morning to all of you. As I have already been presented, I am meteorologist Luis Fernando Alvarado Gamboa from the National Meteorological Institute of Costa Rica. We are very grateful to participate today in this new initiative of the German Cooperation Agency, and where we will gladly be contributing everything that we have as an institution, materials that we have been collaborating with in previous years, and we also want to do it with this excellent initiative around climate refuges. So on behalf of the National Meteorological Institute, our director, Mr. Bernard Stoll, again, we are very grateful to participate in this initiative. And well, I have been invited to show you what we have been doing or working on in terms of climate change scenarios. It is one of the variables, one of the necessary variables to be able to develop these systems that you also want to develop. The climate change scenarios are completely necessary in order to be able to generate and implement these projects that are being developed for climate refuges. So without further ado, I would like to show you what we have been developing in this sense, and please allow me to share my screen. And I apologize because I have not been able to use the logos of the project. The most recent climate change scenarios that we generated were for the year 2021, where we did a very big effort in comparison to previous research or scenarios of including not only the most well-known variables or the most popular ones, which were temperature and rainfall. In this occasion, aside from those, we also included other variables that are very important, which are relative humidity, solar radiation, and wind. But also, aside from this effort of including new variables, we also did an effort of improving the resolution, not only the time resolution, but also spatial resolution. And with time resolution, I want to refer to the fact that the products or maps are not only yearly, but we have done them, or annually, we have done them to show monthly and even daily fractions or details, and we will keep that resolution in time for the next things, and we will soon be launching the following year with generating the scenarios, also addressing the changes that the IPCC has done on the scenarios of the emissions of greenhouse gases. So with these changes that we have been introducing in the time or temporal resolution, but also, like I said, improvements in spatial resolution, because you already know that the global models with which scenarios are created, they also show very big spatial resolutions, but the best now is in 50 kilometers. And as we saw from the presentation of Mr. Mario Cotto, that is not enough for the level of resolution at which these projects are being developed, such as the one you're trying to implement on climate refuges. So it is necessary for spatial resolution to be much more precise. And therefore, these scenarios of 2021, our spatial resolution has gone down to 1 kilometer. And I don't know if this will be enough for climate refuges, but I believe that it can be very helpful in that line of improving the spatial resolution of the scenarios. But well, that is what we have currently. The spatial resolution is at 1 kilometer and the 5 variables I mentioned. I also wanted to refer to a project of the European Union where all countries, all Central American countries joined, and in 2020, the climate change scenarios visor or viewer was shown, and it showed the emissions of greenhouse gases that were much wider than the ones that we had generated in the National Institute of Meteorology, where so with that project, the 4 possible scenarios were covered that the IPCC had issued with regard to the greenhouse gases emissions scenarios. So it's 2.6, the 4.5, the 0.0, and so this viewer was a big novelty because until that moment, we didn't have this way of visualizing climate data. And I think that it came in to fill a very big gap in the community of users, because it was necessary not only to have this views or this visualization, but also that the data could be downloaded at any time and in formats that the community was also demanding, which were formats for geographical information systems. So I think that this viewer of scenarios filled that very big gap even more on the needs that users had. I can mention, for example, that we had back then access not only to global models, but also to models that we call statistical models, which are like these, the analog models and regression models. In each one of them, we had a very wide range of models. And we could also have the option of having an ensemble or an average of all these models. So much for both for the global models, it's called the Cortex models, as well as for the analog models and the regression models, which are statistical models. And you can see here that there's a very significant quantity of models that we could have access to. But aside from this, aside from the climate variables, back then, those were very limited. For example, in terms of temperature, rainfall, wind, and others. But we will see later on that we have extended this range of climate parameters to approximately 70, and of which you can see right now. Aside from that, with respect to the resolution that we were managing back then, or at least in this viewer that we had for the dynamic global models, where resolutions of half a degree, but that improved by using the statistics models, where the resolution went to 0.25 degrees or even 0.05 degrees, both for the regression models as well as the analog models, which is a spatial resolution that is pretty good because we're talking in terms of kilometers. So of 25 and 5 square kilometers, which is the size of the pixel. Well, the viewer generated not only maps, but also what we call time series. So these are forecasts from the year 2010 until the year 2100 in admin units. So it could be the entire country or even regions at the level of provinces or states. Well, but like I explained, we at the National Institute of Meteorology, we did a regionalization called downscaling, which improved the size of the pixel that we had with global models of 25 kilometers, and we reduced that down to 1 kilometer of resolution. But let's remember that it's only for the 5 climate variables that we had used for this study, which were rainfall, temperature, solar radiation, humidity, and wind. But well, for 2024, we are already foreseeing the generation of this new generation of climate change scenarios, where obviously we are going to use the new scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions, and the IPCC had already reported in its 6th report launched in the year 2021-2022. Those scenarios have the acronym SSP, and we use versions 1, 2, 3, and 5. So we are going to use the same viewer, but it has been updated with these scenarios. But also, I wanted to mention that one of my colleagues, she will be in the future, and she is Master Karina Hernandez. She is now dedicated to preparing these scenarios for our country. The changes that we have included with this new generation of climate scenarios that I repeat will be diffused or shared next year in the year 2024 has these characteristics. Notice that there's very important differences. For example, we have changed the scenarios, or actually the models, the global models, where we used to have 10. Now we're going to use 12, but with the new model, updated model, which correspond to CMIP6, which is a project of global models, which the IPCC used it in its new report launched in the year 2021. Aside from that, we are going to continue using models of statistical regionalization, which will be one of these two. And also daily data of temperature of ERA 5 and rainfall of the CHIRPS project, which is a rainfall estimation project, a satellite system, and using meteorological systems with a spacing of 5 kilometers. So like I said before, we are also going to use the scenarios of SSPs, the climate change scenarios indicated here, and also the time horizons. We are going to conserve these, which are for periods of 30 years from 2011 to 2040, 2041 to 2070, and 2071 to 2100. So now, with respect to the climate parameters, as you can see here, we have increased the number from 37 climate indices up to 70 indices, which is a very significant increase, where we are also going to consider the indices of extreme events, the variables and indices of the time resolution, which will be at a minimum a daily resolution, but we can also do aggregations for a monthly period or seasonal, 3 months, 4 months, or up to 12 months, which are annual. And with respect to the spatial resolution for temperatures, it will be kept at 25 kilometers, and for rainfall, it'll be for 5 kilometers. Obviously, like I explained, still these resolutions might not be the most ideal to treat the resolution of the climate refuges. However, we will do again this effort of moving these resolutions, these models, to one of a better resolution, like the one we saw with the previous scenarios, where we can reduce them up to 1 kilometer. And the historical scenario or the baseline is going to be different. In this case, it's going to correspond to 1981-2005, which is the baseline that the CHIRPS project uses for estimating rainfall and temperature. These are the two comparisons of the emissions of green gas houses that we had previously with the IPCC scenarios from report number 5. Here we have the report number 6, which are called Shared Socioeconomical Trajectories, and the acronym in English is SSPs. So these figures show or charts show the figures of CO2 equivalent for each one of these scenarios and the most recent ones as well. Well, so with this, now we could start generating some forecasts or projections where in literature they have already have been done for the country for temperature projections on average for the entire country, or temperature distributions in periods of 30 years, like the ones we have mentioned, and which we see represented here as in temperature, there will be a change or increase in temperature towards higher conditions or higher temperatures. So with regard to the models, I was telling you that we changed from CMIP5 to CMIP6, which the sixth one is like 40 or 42 models that were run, but we are going to only use 12 because it is a habit for those 40 to select which are the best models that are adapted or adjusted to the specific conditions of the country. So that exercise already took place of selecting the 12 best dynamic global models. Aside from the statistic regionalization method, which we will use QDM, or the PSDM, which right now we are actually determining which one of these two is the one that best represents the climate conditions of the country. But these two are one of the two best that literature has shown for statistical regionalization. And in this project, the contributors of the project made a prioritization of sectors. In this case, selected were the agriculture sector and the water sector, for which we have developed workshops with each one of the users of these sectors. And based on these sectors, the indicators of climate change were created. As we can see in the current viewer, there are 14 represented are for temperature, 11 are for rainfall, and 3 are associated to evaporation. Aside from new variables and indices, here represented are even indicators to monitor droughts and 4 to monitor crops. So these are important, which were selected for this project. And well, this other slide, which I believe is my last one, it refers to specifically those climate change indicators, such as, for example, consecutive dry days, which is very important to identify droughts. So very rainy consecutive days, that's for rainfall, but also in temperature, for example, the number of consecutive cold nights, the number of cold nights. And this is very important because also in the climate change projections, we can see that more and more so we are evidencing cold nights. And therefore, or also, actually, on the contrary, we are perceiving warmer nights, not only during the day, but also during the night. And these indicators can be useful to identify throughout time with these projections if truly the number of cold days is going down, or on the contrary, if the warm nights are increasing. Also the parameters related to the daily temperatures, and also the parameters related to humidity and evaporation or transpiration, which is very important for agriculture, which is another one of the sectors that we have prioritized in this work done for climate change scenarios. And with this, I finalize my presentation. I thank you again for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Luis Fernando, for your detailed explanation of the wide analysis that the National Institute of Meteorology does on climate information. This will be a very important input for the development of the proposals that we are framing within this open innovation program. Next, we are going to have Mr. Jairo Sancho Rodriguez, who is a biologist, and also he is a coordinator of the National Biological Corridor Program of the National System of Conservation Areas of Costa Rica since 2015. At the same time, he's the national liaison for the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor. Jairo will talk more about the climate resources. The floor is yours, Jaime. Jairo. We cannot hear him. Está en mute.
Con el micrófono apagado es difícil poder conversar. Okay.
Okay, ready. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, for taking some time and helping us as SINAC in these climate innovation processes, addressing a topic that for us, we have already been working on for several years. Since 2015, we have it within our institutional planning, and it's the topic of climate refuges. What do we understand as climate refuges? So Mario has already spoken a little bit about this. on how climate refuges were built, how they are seen from the origin, so based on climate refuges. And I think that this topic is so important that we have seen it with the help of the National Meteorology Institute. It shows how it impacts human beings in all different areas, but it also has a very deep impact in ecosystems at the level of biodiversity, at the level of presence and distribution of the species. So it's an element that needs to be considered within planning, how we are looking at conservation in the long term and considering these climate scenarios at 10, 20, 30 years. These are elements that need to be included. We, through an exercise that we will talk about more now, that's what we try to see. How do we project the conservation of biodiversity in the long term in a very fragile region, a region that is highly sensitive to the impacts of climate change, and how this can somehow, or how can we, from the institutions that manage biodiversity, figure out how we can increase the resilience of ecosystems and biodiversity. So it was only to give out examples of the elements. We have much more updated information on how the climate is impacting our country. And as I mentioned, not only in the social, economic, and productive areas, but also in the biological area, in the ecosystems. And so, echoing to what Mr. Mario mentioned at the beginning on the climate resources, these are climate refuges, these areas that have been identified as climate refuges, part of an analysis that is done with regard to the distribution and variation of the vegetation, the ecosystem in the country, from the structure of the forest and the river areas and how these respond to climate change variables. So from this future forecast and how climate change can be impacting this conformation of the ecosystem, we started to determine what are the changes that we expect from now until the year 2050. So that's the time horizon, that's the timeline that was used. And from this process as well, we started to identify what are those necessary areas to connect these areas that are mega diverse, because biodiversity is not only to protect some areas, but it's also to connect these areas with other areas as well. So from this exercise, we came to the determination of climate refuges, which also in itself represents or considers several important elements. One of them is microclimates. Normally, in climate refuges, we respond to very specific microclimates of a region, of an area, that makes it different to its surroundings. That's why it's an interesting area to analyze, or it could be a climate refuge, because truly in that space, there's climate variables that differentiate it from its surroundings. It has a very big importance, or the roles of patterns and the distribution of species. In the theory of climate refuges, it is thought of ensuring that biodiversity can be able to migrate, adapt to these new conditions that are happening. In some cases, these are transition areas. So to use a climate refuge, while we are able to have these species adapt to the new climate conditions. In other cases, these are places of refuge where they are going to stay there, protected while the climate conditions pass. With future scenarios, I think that this won't be the situation, he says, but we're actually subjected to constant changes that are going to demand that climate refuges be important elements to be considered within the management that we do as a country to guarantee biodiversity, the conservation of biodiversity in the long term. This part, which was already mentioned by Mr. Mario, these refuges can have play three important roles. Micro refuges, which are those places where the biodiversity can find a specific condition where they can find protection until the climate gets back to its initial conditions. Areas of retention, so places where the populations can use as protection because of some conditions for a period of time while the conditions change and become favorable again. Or trampoline areas. These spaces, these climate refuges, support certain populations of these species of biodiversity while they are able to migrate or move to other more favorable areas. So this is part of the theory that gives rise to why climate refuges should be considered within the platforms of regional planning and within the tools of regional planning, and also why these should be part of the conservation processes. So from this theory of climate refuges, we took on the task of starting to identify what are the climate refuges that at some point we determined for Costa Rica. As you can see, we already have data that has been updated for the year 2021. So back then, when this analysis was done, we used the best available information, and we're talking about information of the year 2014. With the scenarios of the fifth report of the IPCC. And back then, that was the forecast that we had. It was the best information available for us or to us. So what did we do? So from these general circulation models, we started talking about 19 future scenarios projected to 2050. Out of these 19 future scenarios, we started to, and we can say that these are heterogeneous scenarios. They are very different scenarios amongst each other, but within these scenarios, we start to see certain patterns. But we don't identify patterns in the climate conditions. But however, we are looking for patterns in biodiversity. We start seeing what the distribution patterns of biodiversity are associated to this change. And going from the fact that an ecosystem is made up of life factors in that ecosystem, also the factors that are not alive, because it depends on rains, on temperature, etc. So as the climate started changing in a region, that is how biodiversity or ecosystems are expected to change as well. So from this model and trying to consider these future scenarios up to the year 2050, we started seeing how the conditions and the climate patterns at the country level started changing within those possible 19 scenarios, which is what was used in this analysis. And starting from what is meant or selected today and what we would need to have in 2050. What did we do? How did we determine this? We used these climate conditions and we associated them to the seven geographic regions that we have in the country. So we started to look at the distribution of these forest areas. So we started associated them with the climate conditions, and we started to see that with these scenarios from the year 2015 and how we started to project this to the year 2050, basically to figure out what is happening with these phytogeographical areas or these units that we had from 2014 and which eventually were going to change as the climate was changing in each one of those 19 scenarios. And we started to play with probabilities, with certain certainties or uncertainties or likelihoods that this ecosystem was going to remain or it was going to disappear, or in what measure it was going to change based on these future predictions. With these scenarios, these possible changes that were determined in these 19 scenarios, future scenarios up to the year 2050, what we did was to start to identify what are those places within those 19 scenarios in which the climate conditions and the phytogeographical areas were going to remain. So out of those 19 scenarios, in which of those 19 scenarios, in which of those there were 17 areas, or which areas presented or remained constant in each one of them. So we started to see that in the 19 scenarios, there were places that, because the ecosystem changed, there were places where this was constant, it would remain. So there was a certain likelihood that this specific area, because of its climate conditions, because of its ecological conditions, because of its ecosystem, was not going to change, at least in 13 of those scenarios. So from those places that were identified as climate refuges, the areas where there was a certain certainty that the climate was not going to change, we started to look at the tools that we had. And like Mr. Mario mentioned at the beginning, we had the analysis of gruas to the different scenarios of gruas. And from this, we started to pass it through this filter. We started to look at what are these climate refuges and the fragile ecosystems that were there. And we started to check how we can do that in the priority areas, in those conservation gaps, and how these could be adapted for climate change until 2050. So what adjustments do we need to do in the prioritized areas to be able to guarantee this in the long term? And from this exercise, it was possible to prioritize the areas of conservation or the priority areas for conservation. So these are protected areas and biological corridors. So what did this give rise to? So this led us to talk about the biological corridors and the protected areas, and we were able to put on the biological corridors map the climate refuges, and we started figuring out which one of these climate refuges were within or out a biological corridor, and which ones are being considered and managed, if there was management or not, or which ones needed management. And it's what we are going to work on or talk about more later on. And in the country, there is 52 biological corridors, and out of these 52 biological corridors, they represent 38% of the continental territory of our country. When we started doing the analysis of our biological corridor systems, we found out that 20 biological corridors already have climate refuges. They already include them within their area. We did the analysis with protected areas, and we have 171 protected wildlife areas, and they represent 25.5% of the continental territory. And on the protected areas, we realized that there are 337 climate refuges that were already considered within these protected areas. So with this, we were able to ensure that these places, at least with their coverage and their management, were already being considered as part of the management, or at least they should be considered within the management system. So taking these scenarios and looking at the dynamics and thinking about the necessary connectivity so that the biodiversity can flow through these climate refuges or the different ecosystems or phytogeographical units, they studied how many possible climate connectivity routes we needed to develop, how many new biological corridors we needed to start managing or trying to create in order to guarantee the connectivity between those ecosystems, between the areas that were being most impacted by climate change and also the climate refuges that are the places where we expected that it would be good enough for species to adapt. So we had 15 new routes of connectivity for future climate change scenarios, thinking on connecting the climate refuges with those fragile ecosystems or vulnerable ecosystems, and they are distributed in 7 areas, conservation areas. It's 237,000 hectares, 2 new biological corridors, and with this, 2 new biological corridors have been created from this proposal, one called Amistosa in the southern part of the country, and the Southern Pacific, he apologizes, and Parisina, which is on the Caribbean. And why is this important? Well, like I said before, the climate refuges, its management is included within the national management plans. So we have our national biodiversity plan that says that for 2025, Costa Rica needs to effectively manage at least 6 biological corridors that address or are related to climate refuges. So these 2, Amistosa and Parismina, are part of complying with that goal or that target. So with these biological corridors, we connect some of these climate refuges. We did also the analysis from GRUAS, the areas of relevance or importance for conservation, which began in future scenarios as how do those phytogeographical units change as an answer to the changes in biodiversity, and the changes in biodiversity to the changes of climate. So from this, we determined that there are some areas that originally had been defined as priority areas. So as the Costa Rican country, we needed to address them to guarantee the conservation of biodiversity in these spaces, but that it was also necessary to rethink the defined limits that were defined in the beginning, because there are some of these ecosystems were going to disappear because of climate change. So it was necessary to reformulate or to rethink or redefine these areas, both for the land areas or the water areas and also the coastal and marine areas, giving rise to a system where we are considering those priority areas for conservation from those climate change scenarios that we defined in the year 2014, which were the ones being used. And why am I emphasizing when we did this analysis? Because the predictions and climate forecasts have changed. So what we had some certainty on or uncertainty in the year 2014, maybe right now with the new scenarios for 2021 or even 2022 are not so true that they're going to happen, or there's going to be differences. So climate change has been evolving, the new technologies have been evolving as well, and now we have scales of 5 kilometers like we saw before to generate climate information. And this takes us to a scenario in which we have climate refuges within protected areas, within biological corridors that were thought of with scenarios to the year 2014 as important elements to conserve biodiversity. Some, we have included them within biological corridors, others within protected areas, but truly part of the challenge or the question leads us to think, how are these climate refuges? Are they being managed? Well, that's part of what we want to put on the table to discuss it. But here, I just wanted to start, so to wrap up, I wanted to put on the table 2 topics. Management. How do we manage these climate refuges? We work with planning tools as the Costa Rica. We always try to see how to link or tie the management of these climate refuges as part of the actions that we need to perform. In biological corridors, we have the management plans. Every biological corridor has or should have a management plan, how to manage that territory with some specific characteristics. Biological corridors are managed by local actors. There's a local committee of biological corridors, which is a participative platform. It's a volunteer platform where people sit on a table, they define how they want to manage that biological corridor, and even climate refuges within that biological corridor. It's a participative strategy for conservation or conservation strategy, and the biological corridor almost always is private property. They don't belong to the state. So that's why we need to ask how to manage that territory, because we can find, trade, cities, conservation, there's also climate refuges. For the protected areas, we have a tool, which is the National Management Plan or the General Management Plan. And the protected areas, these have an administrator provided by the state, by the country. They are managed by the country, and most of them are property of the state. The Costa Rican state is an owner of these protected areas, but it also includes climate refuges that need to be managed. And to finish, and trying to tie back to what we have mentioned before, are climate refuges effective to conserve biodiversity? So as asked in the initial analysis, and as we have been working, including the management of the biological corridors within the protected areas, these climate refuges with a future scenario for the year 2050, and from the best available information in the year 2014. And this is part of what this program leads us to question or reflect how truly the management of these climate refuges is the management being effective for these climate refuges. And this is all I had for you today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Jairo. Great presentation so that we can better understand the topic that we would like to cover with this open innovation program of generating creative and innovative ideas for this topic by the National Conservation System. Now we're going to start a Q&A session, and for that we are going to enable participants' microphones. So we thank all our speakers today, Marta, Mario, Ruiz, and Jairo. So please be ready to answer the questions that are related to your topic or presentation. And please be very specific with your questions so that we may be able to answer your questions during this session. For this, we're going to have a session of 30 minutes, and I will be giving you the floor according to the order that you raise your hands. Yes, Herman. Herman, we cannot hear you.
No sé si tiene el micrófono deshabilitado.
Can you hear us? Yeah, he was not able to open his mic. I wanted to ask if these types of refuges were identified in the sea areas or the water bodies, not only land. Mr. Herman, thank you very much for your question. In this occasion, the analysis that we have done is at the level of land ecosystems initially. We just updated the marine gruas analysis, where a potential of restoration was identified of some of the coastal and marine areas. But in this opportunity, we also did not go into doing an analysis of this other type of tools of climate refuges. So it's something that we would need to analyze in the future. But thank you very much. We are going to do later analyses related to that. And of course, you're completely welcome to generate any ideas on that as well. Thank you. Thank you. I think Mr. Jairo is going to add to the question. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Herman, for your question. Herman, when we started working on the GRUAS analysis and the climate change scenarios, like Mr. Mario mentioned, we started to notice that the scale and the available sea information was not allowing us to define climate refuges in the sea area, because we had a very big scale, at the level of the Pacific and the Caribbean. So under the model and the methodology that we use, it was not allowing us to be able to find some specific points as climate refuges. This does not mean that with the technology and the information available today that we can be able to do this. I know that in these last almost 10 years, the quality and quantity of information has changed. We did foresee to do an analysis of the marine and coastal area and to find climate refuges in the sea area, but we weren't able to. But yeah, there is a possibility. And like Mario said, we invite you that within the possible solutions or answers to this event that we may be able to address the marine area through the information available. Thank you very much. We have a question on the chat box, also related to the marine coastal areas, on behalf of Maria Fernanda Calvo. Possibly with the information that Jairo has had, we have addressed this question. But if there's any other elements that you would like us to clarify, we can also ask the question. And also here, I see another hand raised of someone who is not identified. We appreciate if you could please introduce your name. I cannot call you by name, so I apologize. Please tell us what your question is. I don't know if it's me, it's Gustavo Solano, and thank you so much for the presentations. My question is very quick. So the implementation periods of the initiatives, what is the minimum or maximum periods? Thank you. Good morning, Gustavo. Very good question. Let's see. Because it is a very open program where the solutions can be very diverse and heterogeneous, we do not have an implementation period. But what we expect is that these be solutions that can be prototyped in a range of time that is short, not more than a year, and that we effectively know that from here, a package of work that is enormous can come, and which can have a research of 2 or 3 years. And we from the project do not have the possibility of supporting a process that is greater from 1 year and more. So we need to evaluate what is the scope of each one of the solutions. And for that, you will see in the guidelines that we are unable to do that or to have a budget and a time, because the idea now is to have the SINAC to have that many of options to say, well, I need to do this, that, or this, and it can be scheduled throughout time and where the different efforts of finding partnerships can be done, new projects, etc. So in summary, it's not determined, and what we would expect throughout the program is to be able to move in a prototype that will allow SINAC to make a decision if this solution can be feasible or not and as efficient as possible. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Gustavo, for your question, and Marta for referring to the question. I don't see any other hands up, so please take the opportunity of asking any question that you may have. We still have some minutes left. Okay, Maureen. Hello, good morning, and thank you very much. Thanks to the speakers as well. Thanks for the space. My question is very specific. Now, with the last or final presentation, according to the National Adaptation Plan to Climate Change, so on Pillar 3, it says that at least 5 biological corridors need to incorporate the management of climate refuges. And I had also been reviewing this document, and I saw that also there is a proposal of creating 2 instruments to ensure safeguarding it. One is a protocol, and the other one is an updated protocol. I would like to know if these documents have already been updated, so to know what process these 2 things have. Okay, let me see. The goals of the National Adaptation Plan has 2 targets. So one of them is to the management of biological corridors. Is that what you're referring to? If not, you'll let me know soon. But so target number 6 is related to how many biological corridors include the management of climate refuges. And there's other targets related to biological corridors, such as the monitoring tools to determine connectivity that is not necessarily related to climate change, but which is associated to showing or demonstrating that biological corridors work to connect protected areas. And there's another one related to the management plans. How or which corridors already have management plans, which is the planning tool in which the topic of climate change is included, and where we also expect to reflect the topic of climate refuges. Is that what you were referring to, Maureen? Yeah, I was talking about the general targets, but I think that these are separate from the corridors, because I see that they're in the 3rd axis or pillar, but in a different points, or in different, I don't know what they call it, she says. Yeah, these are pillars, because one of them is that at least there may be 6 pillars, but another one is 2 instruments prepared to guarantee that safeguard. So it's not within the territories, which is, I believe, the way that you mentioned it. It's separate. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to share my email address, and I'm going to include it on the chat box. And if there is anything that we can talk further about, please write me so we can talk further about this. Yeah, thank you so much, because it's even mentioned within and outside of the protection areas. So it's a little bit more general, but thank you very much. Yes, I'm at your service. Thank you very much, Maureen and Jairo. Are there any other questions on behalf of the participants this morning? While we wait, if there's any other questions, I would like to tell you that the way to ask any questions that you might have is after this presentation is with the email address on screen. So that will be the exclusive way to receive any questions related on this Open Innovation Program. I would also like to remind you that the webpage of the Open Innovation Program There we will be publishing the guidelines and also the application form so that you can send your ideas starting from October 9th on Monday. So that will be and to receive questions or consultations since until the 9th of 20th of October, and receiving those proposals will be until the 9th of November. So we will invite you. If you have any other questions, we are finalizing the event and wrapping up. Any other clarifications on behalf of the participants or additional remarks? Very well. So this way we are getting to the close of this inaugural event. You can see on screen the web page that will be at your disposal to find the information of this call for proposals, the guidelines and the application form. And also after the consultation period is over, we will be publishing or posting all the questions that we have received through the email address that we just shared so that you can ask in writing any questions you may have. So that, excuse me, we have one additional comment on behalf of a participant. So, Mr. Pablo, your microphone is enabled. Yeah, just a general comment. When the climate refuges were made, it was mainly based on the speed of climate change to identify those places. And back then, there was no systematized information to integrate the features or characteristics of the species. And I think that that is a gap that can truly support or help what it is that we are going to monitor in these places of refuge, in these corridors. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paulo, for that message. I think it's part of the needs and the challenges that we are trying to address with these types of events. Very well. Thank you for your interest and your time again for participating today. And we remind you that this recording is also going to be available on our webpage. And we wish you a great weekend. See you soon.